Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So my job this afternoon for the next few minutes is to take you through the Intelligent Energy Systems research strand of the CEAS cluster. And as Fintan has noted, I currently have a joint appointment with NUI Maynooth and Queen's University Belfast, and the activity I'm talking about today is essentially linked with my affiliation with NUI Maynooth. So before taking you through the team and our objectives, I thought it would be useful just to recap on why do we need an Intelligent Energy Systems research strand. And essentially, it all relates to how the power system is evolving. The old style power system was very much a centralised generation system with large-scale centralised generation that's very much predictable, provides high inertia to the system, and generally speaking located relatively near to the load from the point of view of transmission. And it's characterised by basically a power system with unidirectional flows and very much passive load. But with the evolution in the power system, with the introduction of more renewable energy, we now see an evolving power system moving towards a much more complex system involving a mix of renewable generation located geographically dispersed, but more importantly on the distribution side of the network. That type of generation is characterised being very much unpredictable or stochastic and variable. And the net effect is that you're potentially going to have bidirectional flows in terms of power. An added complication is the load is changing in character as well, both in terms of the nature of the load, more electrical load coming onto the grid, for example, the rollout of EVs, but equally the load becoming active and responding to the power system either in terms of the electrical signals or pricing signals. So we have an active load and proactive or prosumers in terms of interacting with the power system. So the major challenge is that how do we actually manage, operate, control such a complex power system in the future, where we have all these interacting elements that don't exist at the moment. Some of them do, but the overall complex implementation of the power system is very much an unknown, and we have to plan for that, but we also have to determine how to operate it and control it in an efficient and robust way. And in a sense, the solutions to some of these problems will come through the use of intelligence systems techniques, so the combination of ICT, control techniques, computational intelligence methods, interfacing with energy systems will provide the mechanisms to operate the future power network. And it's in that sense that sort of the intelligent energy strand has been proposed and developed as part of the CEAS cluster. It's very much a sort of a new idea or a new area for the ERC in terms of a topic. It's building up over the last number of years, but effectively it's really one of the sort of more junior activities within the cluster. So you'll see that a lot of the research is very much in the early stages. So in terms of the team that's contributing to the strand, we have 2 postdocs and 3 PhD students in place at the moment, the pictures on the left, and a number of future hires. Mark already alluded to the plans to recruit a chair in intelligent energy systems within the ERC and UCD, and there are also plans to hire a further PhD student later in the summer. And we also collaborate extensively as a team with the other clusters that you've heard speak here today already. The people on the right, just to mention some of the staff apart from myself, there's Andrew and Damien, who have already here speak today, and also Orla, Philly and Paul Curran are also academic members of the team. So I guess in terms of our initial objectives as a strand, we've identified 4 areas that we're working in. The first of these is to explore the move from centralised to decentralised control of the power system and how that can be achieved and implemented in a scalable way. There's increasing recognition as the power system becomes more distributed and complex that centralised solutions will not be practical, but we have to figure out what forms of decentralised solutions are going to be effective. And at the moment we have 2 active projects in that area that I'm involved in, and one is hierarchical distributed control algorithms for demand response, demand side management, and that's activities that primarily be done by postdoc Paul McNamara, and there's a poster out on the side there that you may wish to follow up on after this if you're interested. The second topic that we have a project on in this space is on decentralised charging strategies for residential charging of EVs. Again, there's a poster on that, but I will also say a few more points about that at work as an exemplar later in the presentation. A second area of activity that we're focusing on as a short term, in the short term, is to look at how to robustify the systems to the uncertainty in the smart grid. So developing control strategies that are robust to the various forms of uncertainty. So there's obviously the obvious form of uncertainty is around the stochastic nature of renewable generation, but there's also going to be increasing uncertainty with regard to the behaviour and availability of discretionary load going forward. So this is a new type of load that certainly in the earlier stage of development there'll be a lot of uncertainty about how much of it is available and how it will behave. So we need to deal with that type of uncertainty. And then the third area of uncertainty that's relevant, particularly relevant, is that as part of the new smart grid, it's going to rely on ICT communication and a lot of communication infrastructure in place. And as part of that communication infrastructure, there's going to be delays and lags in communication and potential failures in communication. So robustifying the operation of the system in the face of all these uncertainties is a major challenge that we need to explore and address as part of this strand. The third area we're looking at is the area of online system identification techniques for the smart grid and for smart grid applications. And what we're focusing on here is basically trying to identify system level parameters that are relevant to the operation of the smart grid. It may be to try to get a real-time estimate of the effective inertia of the system and to deal with the fact that we have a large amount of non-synchronous generation. Having a sense of the level of stability around inertia might be a parameter that might be of interest. Equally, it may be of interest to try to identify the modes of oscillation that are evolving on the power system and feed that information back to controllers at the converter technologies around the generation sources and the interconnectors to try to maintain the stability of the power system. And many other system level parameters may evolve as part of the studies within the ERC that may be useful to identify in real time for the power system. So one of the activities we're just starting off, we have a PhD student starting off in this area at the moment, is to look at the sort of algorithms that are practical to implement to estimate some of these system parameters. And finally, as an objective for the strand, we're looking at stability issues with regard to the operation of the future grid. So again, we don't have these systems in place in large scale at the moment to be able to be confident in them. So we need to make sure that in planning and operation, we also take into account the potential opportunities or areas where instability or limit cycles or inefficient operation might occur. So two examples I mentioned there is that once we introduce active loads that are going to respond to the system, there's potential for coupling between the generation and the load side that hasn't existed in the past. Does that pose issues? Will there be limit cycles or stability issues that need to be addressed there? And similarly, the plans to roll out demand response and DSM type algorithms in a decentralized way, what's the stability issues or questions around those sort of technologies? So these are just some examples of the sort of things that we're looking at in that area. And again, this is an activity that spans a number of the strands. Particularly, we were also working with the modelling group and particularly the group in UL on the modelling side and on the stability side as well. Because a lot of these things rely quite heavily on mathematical analysis. So, just as one example of the work of the strand, I've focused on the EV charging strategies as an example, and the work we're doing in our particular strand on that activity. So there's two elements of this that I'm going to briefly speak to. The first is the issue around about getting data to actually inform the analysis. We don't have a large fleet of EVs on the grid at the moment to be able to see how they're going to behave or get a sense of what's going to be the demand for energy. So we need to refer to other sources of data to try to extrapolate what the situation might be in the future. So in terms of the understanding of EVs, we were interested in establishing, what would be the typical plug-in times in the evening for EVs, or what would be the typical state of charges of EVs when they're plugged in. So the sources of data we looked at for this was a data set known as the Power Car data set that was collected as part of the census and is available from the Central Statistics Office. And basically looking at that data down at the electoral division area, this map shows the density in terms of the colours represents the average journey times on the left, and the variability or the standard deviation in the journey times on the right. But the key message to basically take out of this graph is the fact that the longest journey times, not surprisingly, are in the computer belts around the major urban areas. And the importance of this is that it says that these are the areas where will be the greatest demand for electrical energy with regard to EV charging. So it will be important that the grid infrastructure in those areas can support that level of charging. But equally, it also defines then sort of like the mean, and then similarly we look at the standard deviation in terms of the state of charges or the variability in the state of charges in a particular region. And if you find a region where you have a high average, then there's going to be a high demand, but also all the vehicles won't be the same. So effectively, in terms of modelling this, we can use a sort of normal distribution with the means taken from this graph and the standard deviation from this graph, and we can localise different areas, the potential impact on the grid of particular customer behaviour patterns in terms of plug-in and charging times. So this is ongoing work, and we hope to complete the analysis over the summer, and we'll be publishing some work on it towards the end of the year. So that's basically an example of basically trying to calibrate essentially the simulations that I'll be talking about in the next few slides. So the other area of work that I'm going to talk briefly about is an example of the sort of algorithms that we're exploring as part of our activity. And this piece of work is based around developing a charging algorithm for residential EVs in such a way that we manage the charging so that everybody's not all plugging in at the same time and overloading the grid. The challenge for the power system with regard to electrical vehicles is that this typical consumer behaviour will be to come home in the evening after work and plug in at exactly the time when the grid has experienced a peak in terms of demand. So the natural uncontrolled charging of EVs would mean that basically our peak power requirements would be increased, and quite likely that the local infrastructure will be overloaded because it hasn't been designed with this type of load in mind. So we're looking at trying to manage the charging of these electrical vehicles in a particular residential area, so to mitigate those sort of impacts on the grid. Now, the particular algorithm that we're going to talk briefly about is one that's based on what is known as AIMD, which is additive increase, multiple decrease, which is inspired by work done by Bob Shorten and his group in the Hamilton Institute with regard to distributing bandwidth on communication networks. So the same algorithm has been demonstrated to be very effective communication networks. Bob and his team postulated that it will be also applicable within the charging scenario on the grid. And the basic algorithm that they have is essentially based on the idea that each EV plugs in and starts incrementing its charge rate incrementally in an additive way at each time step, and continues to do so until it reaches the peak charging rate, unless it receives a broadcast signal from a central server to say the available power for charging has been exceeded, back off. So basically, a central server monitors the available power and broadcasts an event signal, a capacity event signal whenever available charging is exceeded. Each EV charger responds to that by resetting to a much lower charge rate and then starts ramping up again. So it's a very simple algorithm in terms of its operation. The charger simply just listens for a capacity signal, and if it doesn't hear it, it just behaves as normally. There's no communications between the chargers, but at the same time, it can be shown mathematically that this very simple algorithm, with very minimal computational complexity and very limited amount of communication, can achieve on average over time a fair distribution of the available power between all chargers connected to the system. So it's a very elegant and simple approach that is used in communication networks and is equally applicable in theory to the power system. The initial work that was done by Bob and his colleagues didn't, however, take into account real constraints on the power system. They just looked at conceptually the application of the algorithm. What we've been doing since then, working with Bob and others, and particularly my PhD student Ming Liu, who again has a poster out here today, who will be happy to talk to you about the work if you're interested in more details. What we've looked at is how to enhance the algorithm and taking into account constraints in the operation of the power system with regard to, say, overloading of local transformers or voltage constraints. So as part of that, we proposed a sort of hierarchical communication infrastructure where we would have local monitoring stations on each of the transformers that will monitor the local infrastructural condition and also listen for information or broadcast from the main substation server. Subsequently then, the local substations would also broadcast information down to the chargers should event occurs. So each of the charge points we propose, in order to deal with the voltage issues, that they are local issues on a grid, so you have to have local voltage sensing to detect them. So we propose that each charger with the capacity to sense its local voltage, and whenever that would drop below a particular threshold level, it would broadcast a signal back to the central server, which then communicate a capacity event to all the chargers in the area. So that sort of hierarchical communication infrastructure sort of overlaps the sort of the natural hierarchical structure of the grid and allows us to implement a more sophisticated implementation of the AIMD algorithm. So just to summarise, the main additional features that we propose as part of the enhancements of the basic algorithm is we've expanded the number of capacity events that can occur. So the generation capacity events is the amount of available power. The voltage event is whenever the voltage at the local line at a particular point drops below a threshold level, and then the local infrastructure constraints, for example, of local transformers are being overloaded. So if any of those events occur, a capacity event message is broadcast to the chargers, and then they reduce their charge rates accordingly. The second aspect of enhancements that we've introduced in the algorithm is we've also modulated the calculation of the available power to include information about the time of use pricing signal as a reflection of basically peak demand. So it's kind of a form of scheduling insofar as that the time of use signal is a reflection of when there's peak demand in the grid and the highest price. Because if we assume that's a fixed a priori information, then we can use it basically to encourage the load to shift to off-peak time. So without using any sophisticated optimization, we can use a heuristic to encourage shifting to off-peak times in the load, while at the same time maintaining the fairness properties of the AMD algorithm. And finally, as part of the implementation, we're proposing that you can also build in fail-safe mechanisms into the algorithm. And once you introduce local voltage sensing on the chargers, clearly, if the communication breaks down and you're not getting capacity events, the charger will keep charging. However, if they detect that the voltage drops below a threshold level, they can immediately shut themselves off. Now, this last feature violates the conditions for fair charging, but the intention here is when you have an extreme event in the system, you want to power down the charger rather than risk overloading the network. And there are also opportunities, for example, if you invest in frequency sensing technology on the chargers, you could also respond to significant frequency dips as well, but we haven't looked at that just yet. So just to finish off then, just to give an example of sort of some of the simulations that we've produced. What we've done is we've used a sort of realistic sort of simulation of a residential area. I think the results I'm showing here are for 160 houses and 80 EVs plugged in, so 50% EV penetration. We based the statistics for the plug-in times, initial charge rates and so on the data that we derived from the census data, and we also generated the default reference profiles for the residential load in these areas based on the smart meter trial data that's available from the CER regulator. So the dashed blue line here represents for the 160 houses, the default residential load profile of those houses picked at random from the data set. I think we had 4,000 houses information to choose from, and we just picked 160 at random to represent the residential profile. So the blue curve is what happened at the moment without EVs. The red curve, what happens is if you basically, when each EV arrives home, they just plug in immediately and charge at full rate. You see that you get, in terms of the power flow available from the main substation, that is exceeded. Whereas if we implement the smart charging strategy that I just outlined, it comfortably retains the load within the limits. And as a second graph, just in terms of the local voltage conditions, again, you can see that when you have the uncontrolled charging, you get a significant voltage deviation below acceptable levels. Whereas with the proposed charging algorithm, you can achieve a reasonable regulation of the voltage level at the residential area. So I guess the key point about this is that this is a framework that's low in complexity in terms of the algorithms and achieves fairness in terms of the distribution of energy between the different EVs without requiring a lot of communication between the individual charge points. As ongoing work, we're in the process of publishing a paper on it, and there's also continuing ongoing activity which we hope to publish later on in the year as well. So I think that brings me to the end of my part of the presentation.